The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. I hope you're having a great weekend, and you're ready for another Yaron Brook Show. And we're going back to politics and to what's going on in the world out there, rather than the topics we've been covering lately. So, hope you're all ready to talk Facebook and the arguments for breaking it up, or more than just breaking it up. Breaking it up, it turns out, is one of the milder proposals that is being suggested out there. So we're going to talk about it. All right. Of course, if you have any comments, suggestions, if you have your own problems with Facebook, solutions to the Facebook problem that is out there, supposedly, feel free to use the super chat to ask questions, make comments, and let me know what you think so I can respond to it if you are so inclined. So on Thursday, the New York Times published a long editorial, 6,000 words, by one of the co-founders of Facebook, Chris Hughes, who has now been involved with the company since 2000, and he at least hasn't owned stock in the company since 2012. He might have left a little bit before that, but obviously it was made very wealthy by selling the stock of Facebook. And has been, at least up until about a year ago, quite friendly with Zuckerberg, and a friend of his, and I guess admires him and is very positive towards him. But he wrote the 6,000 word, not page, word, op-ed titled "It's Time to Break Up Facebook" in the New York Times. And I thought it would be good to comment on this, because I think a lot of issues are raised by this op-ed, just the way it's approached. And then, of course, there's been commentary about this and quite a bit of response to it. And maybe the most striking is Ezra Klein's response. I think when was this? Yeah, this was yesterday. Ezra Klein's response to the idea of breaking up Facebook, basically saying it's not enough. It's not enough. All right, so I want to talk about Chris Hughes' op-ed. I want to talk about Ezra Klein's response, and Ezra Klein's refreshingly honest and direct, although his solutions are horrific and evil. But he at least he shows, how many people on the left think about this. And of course, as we all know, there are many on the right who are calling for the breakup of Facebook as well. So this is not just a phenomenon of the left. This is, I think, something that's going to gain bipartisan support. One of the people mentioned that is working towards doing something about Facebook, that the government will do something about Facebook, is our good old friend Ted Cruz, the senior senator. I guess maybe he's not the senior senator. Anyway, the senator from Texas, who some argued a while back was a defender of capitalism. All right, so that's a show today. We'll talk about that. If there's time at the end, I will comment just because I have to on trade with China. Astounding. And, of course, I will take any questions you have, although, again, I would ask that we start out with Super Chat questions that are only and exclusively related to the Facebook issue, although the Facebook issue is quite broad, so feel free to ask anything related to it. What I want to do is I think it's good for us to actually go through the Chris Hughes op-ed, because I think it brings up so many fascinating issues about how people think about this, and I'm probably not going to hit on all of them. I'm sure if I spend another few hours with the essay, I could come up with another 15 angles to talk about, because it is rich in the conventional way both Democrats and Republicans, both the left and the right, look at the world. And Chris Hughes clearly comes at it from the left, but, not clearly, but there's some clear hints that he comes at it from the left. But it's a way of thinking that unites all those who think about economics, think about capitalism, think about markets, think about government from a collectivistic framework. And that, of course, is something that is common both on left and on the right, and probably the biggest challenge we face today. All right, so as I said, Chris Hughes is a co-founder of Facebook. He's known Mark Zuckerberg from their Harvard days. I guess they were roommates. They shared a house in Silicon Valley when they first moved to Silicon Valley and started the company. He was there when all the major decisions in the early part of Facebook were made. And one of the points Chris wants to make early on is that he likes Mark Zuckerberg. This isn't personal. He doesn't say that, but he implies that. But he makes a deeper point. He's trying to make a deeper point, and he's trying to make the point of, Mark is human. And here he sounds like a conservative, I have to say. Mark is human. And humans, we know, are flawed. Right? Humans, we know, are flawed. And we should be very careful. We should be very careful of giving immense, what he calls unchecked power to flawed human beings. Right? It's interesting, though, and this is true both on the left and on the right, because both, but particularly on the left. On the left, they talk about humans are flawed, and therefore we need massive government in order to check the power of these flawed individuals. And they never consider the idea that the people in power, government power, are flawed as well, that they're also human by this logic. Of course, conservatives usually use the humans are flawed argument to defend capitalism. What they say is, yes, humans are flawed. We agree with you, humans are flawed. And therefore, we don't want to give politicians too much power. We want to disperse power. And, capitalism is the ideal system for flawed human beings. And Ayn Rand was brutal in her critique of this argument for capitalism, an argument from depravity. Hayek makes this argument, and almost all conservatives make this argument. It's our inability to reason, our inability to be rational, our lack of information, our lack of knowledge that makes capitalism necessary, which is the opposite of Ayn Rand's view, which is it's the fact that we can reason, it's the fact that we're rational, it's the fact that we can be good, it's the fact that we are able, that we are competent, that makes capitalism necessary. Right? So, right from the beginning, that comes out of this. So Mark Zuckerberg, he's human, and therefore he is flawed, and therefore we don't want to give him unchecked power. Now, one thing I want to talk about right off the bat, because this kind of fuels this entire article. It fuels all the articles on the Facebook issue. No matter where people come down on this, it ultimately is kind of in the background, and it's a crucial, important issue that you have to think about, and that is that they equivocate. All the articles equivocate between two kinds of power. They see no difference, and this the left has always done, and the right is doing this constantly. Right? The two types of power, political power and economic power. The idea is they're both unchecked power. They're both power. They're the same. And indeed, the way to cure one is to use the other. The way to cure excess economic power is to use political power. Now, there is, however, a fundamental, and this is to a large extent, this is one of the fundamental problems in all these arguments. One of the fundamental problems in all the arguments. Not the, but one of them. is that they can't differentiate between economic power and political power, and they don't see the difference. They don't see the fundamental difference between what constitutes political power and what constitutes economic power. So what is the difference between economic power and political power? Well, the fundamental is that political power does not rely on voluntary association. It relies on coercion and force. Government is force. Government power is the force to coerce. It is the power to coerce. It is the power of the gun. It is the power to force you to do things you don't want to do. It's not about voluntary exchange. It's not about voluntary association. It's not about trade. There is nothing voluntary about government actions. Government actions are coercive by their essential characteristic is coercion. You pass a law, and if people don't follow it, they're in violation of the law, which means they have to go to jail, pay a fine. Force is inflicted on them. The essence of government is force. The essence of economic power is voluntary trade, voluntary association. You do not have to work for any particular company. You do not have to buy any particular products. And you do not, and I know this will shock many of you, particularly those of you watching this on Facebook, you do not have to be on Facebook. You don't. Really. You can get off if you choose to. And it's not like you have to have an alternative. No. Human survival, individual human survival is quite possible. And some would argue even preferable. Without Facebook in your life. Facebook is not a requirement of human survival. But even those things that require human survival require your energy and effort and require your voluntary association, your voluntary trade with other people, potentially. But Facebook is something you voluntarily engage in. So economic power is based on voluntary association and voluntary trade, voluntary participation. Either party can walk away, and I mean either party, because that also means, because it's voluntary, that Facebook can decide that they don't want to associate with you. They don't like you. So Facebook has the right to discriminate in terms of who it associates with, who can use its platform and who can't. And you have the ability, right, to not be on Facebook. And that's the essence of economic power, is even if you grow very powerful from an economic perspective, have a lot of money, have a lot of market share, you still cannot force people to use you. You still cannot force people to interact with you. You still cannot force people to be employed by you or to provide you with services. The whole basis of a capitalist economy, a free economy, is the idea of voluntary exchange. And even in a semi-free world in which we live, the essential is voluntary exchange. Now, the government restrains that and limits that, unfortunately, through the use of coercion, through the use of political power, through the use of force. For example, Facebook can't discriminate in certain cases. Okay? It can discriminate ideologically. It can't discriminate, for example, based on color of skin or sex or orientation or whatever, right? Which it should have a right to do. But still, the scope of voluntary choice and voluntary interaction is still quite substantial. We still live in a society that is far from fully, and I don't know what percentages, but still is powered by voluntary association. The marketplace is still powered within the constraints of bad laws, within the constraints of the coercive power of government. Within those constraints, we still voluntarily associate. And none of these people differentiate between that. To them, they are the same. And of course, this goes back to the Sherman Act. It goes back to antitrust laws. It goes back to all of the legal precedent, the coercion of government, that it cannot differentiate. It does not differentiate between those two forms of power, and it assumes they are the same. It assumes that because you have 80% of a market or 90% of a market, even 99% of the market, you are somehow forcing people to use your product. Forcing in the sense of coercing. And that's just not true. It's just not true. Right. Whoops. Now, there is an argument to be made that in a crony economy, there is a mingling of economic and political power. And indeed, we're going to get to that. Facebook's call on regulators to regulate it is exactly that, is giving Facebook, through government, political power, because that regulation is probably going to restrict competition. It's probably going to entrench Facebook into the position that it has. And when that happens, one must fight against it. So one must always fight against regulation, against government expansion, against government control, against more and more and more power in the hands of those who wield a gun, in the hands of government. Right? Wielding a gun should only be tolerated, approved of, if it's done in self-defense. Not if it's done in order to protect some companies against competition. All right. Let's see. So let's go back to Chris Hughes's argument, and he's making an argument that that Mark is all powerful. I mean, part of the article is very much to put it all in Mark Zuckerberg's lap, if you will. This is not a company that is even run by the board of directors, he argues, because Mark Zuckerberg controls 60% of the voting shares. So the board actually doesn't really oversee the company because the shareholders can't vote against Mark. Mark also doesn't just own Facebook, He owns Instagram and WhatsApp, which involves billions of people every single day using. Now, and only Mark gets to decide how to configure Facebook's algorithms, although of course he doesn't, to determine what people see in their news feeds, what privacy setting they can use, and which messages actually get delivered. He sets the rules for how to distinguish violence and incendiary speech from the merely offensive, and he can choose to shut down a competitor by acquiring, blocking, or copying it. So it's interesting. We've gone here from demonizing just a corporation as all-powerful, having control over all these things, to now focusing on the CEO, on the owner, and driving it. Mark Zuckerberg is too powerful. It's Mark that we need to control. Now, interestingly, he describes kind of Mark's character a little bit, which is fascinating, because again he has this almost love-hate relationship with Mark Zuckerberg, because you can tell he greatly admires Mark, and yet he thinks, he doesn't say this, but he implies it, that Mark has become some kind of in a sense monster of his own making. He says Mark is single-mindedly focused on growing the company, on becoming the best, on becoming in a sense competing away, beating the competition no matter what it takes. No, within the law. I mean, without violating anybody's rights. So he talks about the Mark's focus on growth has led him to sacrifice security and civility for clicks. Not thinking about things like, again, Chris Hughes, right, changing how it would change the culture, influence election, or empower nationalist leaders. That's where you get a sense of where he's coming from politically, is suddenly there's an empowering nationalist leaders. What about socialist leaders? Maybe he could empower socialist leaders. I mean, that he would never, I guess, object to. And he talks about Marx, single-minded focus on being the best and winning the competition and, being, dominating the field. Right? Dominating the field. And then, of course, he goes into this whole analysis of, this is not what America's about. Right? He writes, America was built on the idea that power should not be concentrated in any one person because we're all fallible. This is the conservative, to some extent, founders' argument. But the founders had a deep understanding of individual rights. So the idea of lack of concentration of power had more to do with rights and checks and balances, and the idea of what it meant to protect than it just meant in terms of fallibility. But he and many conservatives turned this idea of fallibility into the central argument. There's no issue of protection of rights or anything like that. So he talks about, we've created a system of checks and balances in order to exactly protect this. And again, notice, no differentiation between political power and economic power. Political power and economic power are the same. So if we've done this in the realm of politics, if we've created checks and balances in the realm of politics, then we must create checks and balances in the realm of economic power. It is just unacceptable to give corporate actors, private individuals, the kind of economic power that we've supposedly, not allowed our politicians to have. Although it's really interesting because, of course, in the end, he's got solutions for what should be done about Facebook. And his solutions give a lot of power to politicians. A lot of power to the politicians. He quotes John Sherman, author of the Sherman Act. And so just to show you that these attitudes are not new. They didn't come about yesterday. They didn't come about because of Facebook. They didn't even come about, because of, anytime recently because of the left dominating the world. Indeed, John Sherman was a Republican congressman. Ohio Republican. I think it wasn't a congressman, he was a senator. So here's the quote from Sherman. If we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessities of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade with power to prevent competition and to fix the price of any commodity. No difference. No difference between political power and economic power. No difference. But what is coerced, what is forced, and between what is voluntarily exchanged, what is voluntarily engaged in, what is a product of voluntary association and trade. And of course, he gives the example of, and we did this. We broke up monopolies like Standard Oil and AT&T, never mentioning all the protections AT&T got before they were broken up. And of course, not that I supported the breakup of AT&T, I'm just saying AT&T would have never existed if not for the support as a kind of monopoly without government support beforehand. And of course, never mentioning that by the time the Justice Department actually broke up Standard Oil, it had less than 30% of the oil refining capacity in the U.S. Antitrust was irrelevant to them. And then he gives us a little bit of history, right? A little bit of history. He talks about, and this is interesting, right? Because this is a story, again, the leftist economists and politicians have a story that they've now composed about kind of the economic history of the United States, the golden age, the greatest period of the American of the American economy, were the 1950s and 1960s. They were amazing. They were when the middle class supposedly was created. They were when wages of working class Americans were through the roof. They were the period when inequality shrunk. They were this amazing period of time. And then came the 1980s and Ronald Reagan, and since then, it's just been a disaster. And since then, it's just been horrible. And the manifestation of that horror is primarily the expansion of inequality, and that's really a disaster. But they all go back to that period between the 60s and 80s and the 1970s. And here's kind of the interpretation of what happened. And this is Chris Hughes. Starting in the 1970s, a small but dedicated group of economists, lawyers, and policymakers sowed the seeds of our cynicism of government power. Over the next 40 years, they financed a network of think tanks, journals, social clubs, academic centers, and media outlets to teach an emerging generation that private interests should take precedence over public ones. Right? The gospel was simple. Quote, supposedly free markets are dynamic and productive while government is bureaucratic and ineffective. By the mid-1980s, they had largely managed to relegate energetic antitrust enforcement to the history books. So the story is that deregulation, tax cuts, and the relegation of antitrust enforcement to the history books is what brought about the decline of the American economy. And since the 1980s, the American economy has been declining. Now, I have criticized this story in the past. It is absurd. It is nutty. It is insane. It is historical. It is economical. It doesn't tell economic history correctly. It also presents Ronald Reagan as this laissez-faire president. And since then, we've had laissez-faire capitalism, and everything's being deregulated. And no antitrust. And of course, it was the 1990s when they went after Microsoft, which is interesting because he cites the Microsoft case afterwards. He knows it happened in the 1990s, but yet since the 1980s, the energetic antitrust enforcement is gone. I mean, even the Trump administration has blocked a number of mergers recently through antitrust regulations, never mind the Obama administration and the Bush administration. And, they haven't done antitrust enough according to these people's standards. But this idea that we've had laissez-faire capitalism since the mid-1980s, and that has resulted in the decline of the American economy, and that we had a wonderful economy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which is bizarre. And, it's exact reverse. We've had an amazing economy from the 80s. Look at the technology and look at the innovation and look at the leadership position we have in the world. And we were clearly in decline starting in the late 60s and into the 1970s as an economy. But I don't have the time to deal with that because we're talking about Facebook today, not about the U.S. economic history. But note that anytime you see, and this is, I've talked in the past about how important it is that people actually know something about economics and history and economic history. Every time you see a criticism of the current state of so-called capitalism, whether it's by Ray Dalio, or whether it's Elizabeth Warren, or whether it's Thomas Piketty, or whether it's Krugman, or any of these people, right? From typically from the left, but also from the right, because the right doesn't have an argument against this. This is the story they tell. They tell exactly the same story. And it's one of these things that if you say it enough times, if you repeat it enough, over and over and over again, then people just accept it. It's now part of the history of the United States. Right? Since the 80s, we're in decline. And if you really want my answer to this, the best answer to this so far written anywhere is in my book with Don Watkins, Equal is Unfair, where we take this apart. So I encourage all of you, it's on Amazon, you can get it in audiobook, you can get it on a Kindle, you can get it in any format you want. Equal is Unfair. And part of what the book does is it sets the historical record right. We do something similar, not quite as explicit in Free Market Revolution, but because these kind of arguments were less They were less prevalent back then, right? These are the arguments that have come out, I'd say, in the last 8 years have really started to dominate the conversation and to become folklore now. Okay, he goes on, right? He goes on with this mythology. He says, this shift combined with business-friendly tax and regulatory policy, again, this move towards laissez-faire, ushered in a period of mergers and acquisitions that created mega corporations. Now, again, this is a historical, and I have to comment on it, even though it kind of diverts us from Facebook, because it just sets the framework of how these people think and how if they're willing to lie about the past, then obviously you can't trust anything they say about the present. The 1970s and 60s and 70s were a period of massive amounts of mergers and acquisitions, which led to mega corporations, the big multinational, multi-diversified corporations that landed up inefficient, unproductive, uncompetitive, and were lousy businesses. And what the little bit of deregulation that Reagan did, and what that led to, and what people like Michael Milken facilitated during the 1980s, is the breakup of the mega corporation, is the actual breakup of the conglomerates that dominated American business during the 60s and 70s. And actually, through that breakup, through the mergers and acquisitions, the hostile takeovers, and then the breaking up of these companies, created a far more efficient, productive economy. Through those breakups, through the shutting down of factories in what was called the Rust Belt, because it was rust, it was ancient, it wasn't productive, it wasn't competitive. Through shutting down, freeing up that capital, Silicon Valley was created. That capital didn't just evaporate. It was reinvested in where growth was happening. It was reinvested where profits were evident. It was reinvested to change the world. Without the Milkens, without the hostile takeovers, without the breakup of those mega corporations, Silicon Valley could not exist. So the mergers and acquisitions happened in the 60s and 70s, the period he loves. The 80s were a period of breakups. And then, what is never discussed, are the laws and regulations that were passed primarily by states, not so much at the federal level, by states, that made it more and more and more difficult to break up companies, to do hostile takeovers, to do leverage buyouts. It made it more and more and more costly. SEC regulations that made it more and more costly, but primarily at the state level, to do these kind of activities. And as a consequence, we're starting to see again in America the rebirth of the mega corporation or the diversified conglomerate, although that's not the case with Facebook. But that is a consequence of government intervention. Government intervention is what brings that about. And if those mega corporations, if those conglomerates are inefficient economically, then in a free market what would happen is people would buy them through a hostile takeover and break them apart and make them more efficient. That's the beauty of markets. But if you make that expensive, if you make that impossible, then it doesn't happen. But that's the state, that's government, that's coercion, that's political power that is infringing on economic power. The economic power of capitalism to constantly work to improve efficiency and productivity. And again, nobody talks about that, even those who pretend to be defending capitalism. So he says in the past 20 years, more than 75% of American industries, from airlines to pharmaceuticals, have experienced increased concentration, and the average size of public companies has tripled. I don't know if that's inflation adjusted or not. But anyway, yes, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is the lack of hostile takeovers, the lack of leverage buyouts, the disappearance, the eradication of Michael Milken, the putting Michael Milken in jail, which is what you statists did. has made it impossible, to the extent that American companies are growing too big. I don't know if that's true or not, but to the extent that they're growing too big, it's impossible now to shrink them because the market to shrink them has been outlawed by government, by political power, the power of coercion, the power of the gun. He says that the consequence of this has been a decline in entrepreneurship, stalled productivity growth, and higher prices and fewer choices for consumers, which is bizarre. Just bizarre. Prices, particularly where the mega corporations, Apple, Facebook, Google, higher prices? Fewer choices? Really? I mean, again, selectively. So he goes to pharmaceuticals, airlines. Anybody know what the price of airlines was, of flying was before deregulation? I mean, the cost to fly has plummeted, has dropped dramatically. Dramatically. And how do you measure whether pharmaceutical prices have gone up or down? I don't know. If a drug now saves a life for a disease that couldn't be even dealt with 20, 30 years ago, and now the price of this drug is $100,000, which is just like the price of an operation. So I don't see what the big deal is. It's $100,000. Has the price gone up? Really? Because the price was zero before because you were dying? What does it even mean? And people throw out these things as if they're presenting you with evidence, as if there's a logic here. But it's complete garbage. There's no logic. There's no reason. There's no rational thinking. There's just bromides. Spewing out bromides is supposed to scare you. Prices have gone up because we've got all these we've got mega corporations. So he writes that, of course, the same thing has happened in social media and digital communication. Yeah, really? Productivity growth is stalled. Entrepreneurship has declined. And we have higher prices and fewer choices. I mean, is that really true? 20 years ago, there was no social media. So, I mean, it's just, again, the way, somebody should have edited this just for plain logic. He writes, because Facebook so dominates social networking, it faces no market-based accountability. Really? Again, you can turn it off. You can walk away from Facebook. The reason most of you don't is because it's still true that the benefits Facebook provides you far outweigh whatever you perceive the costs to be, whether it's costs involved in privacy or whether it's cost in terms of behavior that Facebook engages in that you don't like. But if those costs are high enough, you will stop using Facebook. You will. At least if you're rational, you will. This means that every time Facebook messes up, we repeat an exhausting pattern. First outrage, then disappointment, and finally resignation. Yeah. Yep. Unless we're willing to actually abandon. And then he goes into kind of the history of Facebook. He talks about, their growth. And again, he goes back to this idea that from the early days, Zuckerberg always talked about domination. And again, there's this purposeful, or maybe it's not purposeful, maybe it's subconscious, but there's this use of domination, and domination's, but there's this use of domination as if it's a political word, right? As if it's about, crushing people, dominating people through political power, through force. Whereas, obviously, Zuckerberg is talking about domination in the marketplace. And every successful entrepreneur wants to dominate his market. Every successful entrepreneur is motivated to have a dominant market position. That's how you make real money. Everybody tries that. Not everybody succeeds, but everybody tries it. Peter Thiel calls it monopoly power, create a monopoly. He says every entrepreneur tries to create a monopoly. Every entrepreneur should try to create a monopoly because that's where the profits are. Of course, I don't like using the word monopoly for that, but dominant market share, absolutely. That's what you're in business to do. That's what every competitor to Facebook, which has failed, which it tried to do, to dominate the space, so they could make money. And of course, he talks about the fact that, and he loves competition. So what Chris Hughes says he loves is competition, and this competition drove Facebook to continuously innovate and continuously become better and better and better. And of course, he says it was this. And I'm quoting from him. It was this drive to compete that led Mark to acquire over the years dozens of other companies, including Instagram and WhatsApp. In 2012 and 2014. There was nothing unethical or suspicious in my view in these moves. He wanted to be the best. He saw great technology, and it was cheaper for him to buy it than to recreate it. Later, of course, Chris complains about the fact that Zuckerberg often, I think he gives the example of Vine, often observes somebody else's technology, sees its success, and then copies it in a sense. That's just the same competition. Why is that bad? How is that bad? In what sense is that bad? He sees the market desires, short videos that disappear, or whatever Vine had, and you give it to the marketplace. You provide it. That is what particularly a platform that's trying to provide its customers with multiple products does. All right. Chris says, Facebook today is worth $500 billion and commands, by his estimate, more than 80% of the world's social networking revenue. It is a powerful monopoly, eclipsing all of its rivals and erasing competition from the social networking category. It's interesting that somebody has 20%. And it's interesting that a big behemoth like Google tried to compete with Facebook, right? And you can't say that Google lacked, resources or capital or anything like that, and yet it couldn't compete with Facebook. I don't know if you know, but Google's attempt at social networking just, what was it called, Google Plus, I think just shut its doors a few weeks ago. Because, that's important because it relates to Ezra Klein's critique of Chris Hughes. Chris Hughes wants more competition. Ezra Klein says, wait a minute, Chris. Competition is what led to this problem. It's the competitive juices that led to where we are today. Facebook, social media is a scale business. And you have to be, competition is what led Facebook to acquire and to grow and to be the best. And that's why people adopted it. It didn't beat MySpace by buying MySpace. It beat MySpace by beating MySpace. But why can't MySpace and Facebook coexist? The reason they can't coexist is because we as consumers don't want to be on 55 different social media platforms. As it is, I think there are too many. I'm constantly on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, right? It used to be really a little bit on Google Plus. Thank God it's gone. On YouTube, YouTube is in a sense a kind of a social media platform. I've got 4 social media platforms that I engage in. It's way too much. I would love to have one. But that one has to dominate. Because my purpose on being on social media is to reach a wide audience. Therefore, there needs to be a wide audience on the social media platform for me to reach them. So you don't create, you can't have, and this is Ezra Klein's point, and I think he's absolutely right. You can't have you probably can't have, who knows what would happen in a marketplace, but you probably can't have a non-dominant social media platform that serves its customers well, that actually does what we want social media to do. So he wants, as we'll see, Chris Hughes wants He wants competition. Right? He also says 70% of American adults use social media and a vast majority on Facebook products. Over 2/3 use the core site, a third uses Instagram, and a fifth use WhatsApp. Wow, 70% of American adults use social media. What happens to the 30% who don't? Do you think they shrivel up and die? Because supposedly, not using social media is not an option. Never mind using a different social media platform. What happens to the 2/3, the third is not using the core Facebook site? Are they using a competitor site? Maybe there is competition? Small? I know a lot of people, for example, use LinkedIn because it serves their purpose more than Facebook does. Is that not competition? It's fewer than a third of people report using Pinterest, LinkedIn, Snapchat. A third is a lot of people. Why is this not competition? I mean, if you take China out, pretty much half of the people in the world use, or something like half of the people in the world use iPhones and half the people use Samsungs. I guess there's no competition there either. That's why they don't constantly improve the features of their products, because there's just no competition. There's just two companies. It can't be competition. And Facebook is constantly driven to improve whatever it does because there's no competition. Okay. Wait, those of you eager to talk about the free speech stuff, we're going to get to the free speech, and Chris Hughes talks about it, and we're going to get to it's not the free speech issues, the speech issues, not free speech. Anyway, so it's all about Facebook's dominance and it beating the competition, and the fact that regulators allowed it. I mean, the great sin is that regulators allow it to buy Instagram or WhatsApp. I don't know why that's such, I don't know why that is the dominance. I mean, Facebook in and of itself seems to have a pretty dominant position. Why is it that he keeps repeating this, and I see other articles, everybody talks about these two acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, and that's what really is devastating. We need to spin these off. We need to force them to sell them. It's just, I don't know that many Americans who use WhatsApp. But he says what the real danger is when Zuckerberg completely integrates WhatsApp and Instagram into Facebook. Then you'll have one platform with everything on it, all the services you ever wanted. Oh my God, isn't that scary? All right, let's skip forward a little bit. He also, as proof of the fact that there is no competition again, no social media networking company has been founded since the fall of 2011. I mean, I'm not going to challenge that. I don't know. Although Vine might have been, I don't know. I'll just leave it at that. My answer to that is, so what? He says, as market become more, maybe because people are pretty happy with Facebook and it's hard to establish the kind of networking effect and the kind of benefits that size has, it's hard unless Facebook really, really stumbles. And it might be stumbling, and maybe there's a desire to do that. As market become more concentrated and the number of new startup businesses decline, right? As markets become more concentrated. So he says, for example, nobody's competing with Google on search. Nobody competes with e-commerce with Amazon. But meanwhile, there are plenty of innovation in areas where there is no monopolistic domination, such as in workplace productivity, urban transportation, Lyft, Uber, Linebird, and cryptocurrency exchanges. Now, again, no discussion about the nature of the marketplace. I mean, an economist would actually think, why is there more competition in terms of more variety of firms in one space than another? What phase of innovation are they in? Are these companies that benefit from economies of scale or don't they? Think about Amazon, for example. How long did it take Amazon to reach the complete, not a dominance it has today? Well, a long time. Years and years and years, I'd say a couple of decades of losing money. Well, maybe Uber is just in the beginning of that cycle. Maybe Uber will dominate urban transportation, but it just needs a couple of decades to do it. And over time, it will, as it loses money, drive Lyft and everybody else out of business, right? I guess he includes Lyman Bird, which are companies that sell scooters. I mean, to some extent, competitors with Ubers, and if Uber and another are not. Anyway, it's a mishmash. The whole thing's a mishmash. But you really have to think about these things. You can't just throw this stuff out there, right? And I don't know that much about these kind of things, these technologies, but you can't just throw a bunch of stuff out there and say this is the phenomena without actually explaining it and articulating in a case and analyzing, and and there's nothing to suggest that that's done in the background and these are just his conclusion. This is just his, anyway. Now again, he says, and Mark, look, Mark is not, he's out for domination, but he's not a bad guy. He's a good guy. He's just a talented entrepreneur, and he's motivated. But this is the side effect. The side effect is he gets more power than anybody should have, and he acts like a little dictator. All right, so here we are. We've got this monopoly, and it's interesting. He says you don't really have a choice to use Facebook, and this is the example he uses. He says, this is the example he uses. Some days, lying on the floor next to my 1-year-old son, as he plays with his dinosaurs, I catch myself scrolling through Instagram, waiting to see if the next image will be more beautiful than the last. What am I doing? I know it's not good for me or for my son, and yet I do it anyway. The choice is mine, he continues, but it doesn't feel like a choice. Facebook seeps into every corner of our lives to capture as much of our attention and data as possible, and without any alternative, we make the trade. Oh my God. This is just after he's, there's nothing nefarious about Microsoft, but it seeps into every corner of our lives, and we have no choice. We have no choice anymore. And you'll see that later on, he compares Facebook to a tobacco company. It sells us an addictive product. Now, as you know, as most of you, I think, could imagine, I do not believe that tobacco should be regulated. And I do not believe that, smoking should be banned by government. But notice the analogy, and they're going to use this. You're going to hear more and more of this. He's introduced this. Now it's going to become a regular thing. This is like smoking. Facebook's like smoking. You need to regulate it. You need to control it. And he actually proposes maybe children shouldn't be allowed to use Facebook. Or maybe the government should institute a number of hours the children should be able to watch Facebook. I think that was him and not Ezra Klein. We'll get to Ezra Klein later, but I think that was him. Right? And then, of course, he goes into the privacy problems, and he says, of course, competition won't necessarily spur privacy protection. Regulation is required to ensure accountability. We need regulations. We need government. So we've got 3 problems as he sees it. It's monopoly power over an addictive product, over a product that has no competition, over a product that is, that we don't have any choice but to consume because of its addictive power. Somebody's asking about secondhand smoke. Another time, people. Another time. And there's no secondhand smoke to Facebook. I can't imagine what it would be. I guess if you look at the Instagram instead of playing with your child is suffering. Therefore, the child should be able to sue Instagram for distracting the parent. There you go. There's the secondhand smoke effect. Also observe that tobacco actually has physical effects on you. It actually damages you. So there's some case to be made that you should be able to sue a tobacco company if it was hiding the damage that was being done to you from you, if that were the case. But Facebook is not causing you physical damage. Anyway, 3 things. 1, it's a monopoly. 2, privacy. We know they've got all this data, they abuse it, they leak it, they let other people have it, and they know all this stuff about you. You should be scared. They know stuff about you. Now, I think the solution to the privacy stuff, he argues, of course, the regulation. I think it's the third party, it's the doing away with the third party doctrine, which is Amy's big thing. It's to place the ownership of data back in the hands of the individual, not in the hands of, not once you give it up, the government can access it, because the real villain here is government accessing your information. And again, that is because there's a fundamental difference between political power and economic power. The only thing that Facebook could do with my information in terms of economic power is feed me ads that they think I will like, or feed me news that they think I will respond to. Neither one of those I view as harmful. Both of them actually are quite positive. I actually enjoy the ads that they actually do send me, because they figured out what are the kind of things that I want, and they provide me with information about products that I never knew existed. I'm often stunned by the kind of stuff that comes in my Facebook feed in terms of the new products that I didn't know existed, but they think that I will find an interest in. I mean, it's great. So I have no problem. I have a lot less problem with the privacy stuff. Plus, you can change your privacy settings. You can control that. The third, of course, is what everybody's talking about these days. And here he says, he says, the most problematic aspect of Facebook's power is Mark Zuckerberg's unilateral control over speech. There is no precedent for his ability to monitor, organize, and even censor the conversations of 2 billion people. Wow. I mean, this guy is more powerful than anybody with a gun. This guy is more powerful than government. There's no difference between political and economic power. He can censor us. Now note, again, this using the word censor where it's not appropriate. Censorship is something only the government can do. Censorship is only the government can do, or private parties can do by using force, and then the government is responsible because the government has not protected you from those parties. But censorship is an act of force. It's an act of violence. It's not something that you engage in as part of a voluntary trade relationship, which is what Facebook is. He writes, Facebook engineers write algorithms that select which users comment on experiences end up displayed in your newsfeed of friends and family. These rules are proprietary and so complex that many Facebook employees themselves don't understand them. I wonder if Mark understands them. Now, I don't think the algorithms are good. I don't think that the algorithms are, that the rules that Facebook has put into place are healthy, good, productive rules in terms of, who it deplatforms and who it doesn't, the way it does the news feeds. I mean, I don't know what they should be, those rules. I haven't given enough thought, but, people who have worked at Facebook, people who know Facebook, have said, and have told me, but have said publicly, that Facebook, the people at Facebook are politically biased, that the algorithms are slanted, and you can see the slant in Chris Hughes' whole attitude. Hughes comes at everything here from a leftist perspective, right? So all of this is slanted, and that they obviously don't do a good job, and they didn't do a good job during the 2016 election. They allowed this garbage, this fake news to get more visibility than it should have, given that it's fake and useless. And today they're using newsworthy sources, but how do they define newsworthy? And if they are so ideologically single-minded, what is going to qualify as newsworthy is only going to come from one side of the political spectrum, and it's unlikely to come from other sides of the political spectrum. And it isn't what Facebook was. We'd hope Facebook would be. It isn't as good as I would like Facebook to be. It isn't as good as maybe many of you would like Facebook to be. It's the best we have so far. I know people who might be working on alternatives, whether it's Jordan Peterson, whether it's Dave Rubin, whether it's others out there working on a variety of different alternatives to what Facebook presents. So I don't think competition is gone at all. But right now, Facebook is not ideal because it's not mine. I mean, if it was mine, it would be ideal, right? I'm kidding. Because I don't like certain features of it. I mean, I don't use Facebook that much, although I interact with Facebook a lot, but I use it. I'm very single-minded in how I use it as a marketing platform. Now, I don't really get my news and stuff. I look at the news feed a little bit, but not hugely. I look enough to get those ads that I told you about. But it doesn't dominate my life in any kind of way. And I think they're not doing a good job. I think a lot of companies out there, I think American Airlines sucks. I use it all the time. I fly nonstop. And I think it sucks because customer service is not good. And, I have explanations why I think American Airlines sucks. There are explanations for why Facebook sucks. But the solution can't be, because I don't like what they do, bring in the government. Let's break them up. So he's criticizing, so he goes on to say, Facebook has responded to many of the criticisms on how it manages speech by hiring thousands of contractors to enforce the rules that Mark and senior executives develop. Rules, and from what I hear, are not good. After a few weeks of training, these contractors decide which videos count as hate speech or free speech, which images are erotic and which are simply artistic, and which live streams are too violent to be broadcast. Right, so contractors doing it based on, algorithms and based on the dictates of Mark and senior executives. We'll see what his alternatives is. Instead of having contractors, we'll see what the alternative is when we get to his solutions. Right? For example, he gives an example of Myanmar, where in 2007, Mark Zuckerberg decided that he was going to delete all the private messages on Facebook users that were encouraging genocide in Myanmar. So there was this attempt to spark genocide. So certain messages were sent to the Buddhists, certain messages were sent to the Muslims with the idea that they would attack each other and kill each other, but primarily motivated to slaughter the Muslims in this case, for there to be genocide against Muslims. And he decided to delete all those messages. And of course, Chris says, look, in this case, that's a good idea that he decided that. But God, Mark did this without any accountability to anybody. There was no independent authority or government to decide what values, by what standards he should decide to delete all private messages in this case and not in others. Think about that. An individual person making decisions about his own property, about how to use his own platform. And what he really needs is we need an independent authority. What does an independent authority mean? We need a government bureaucracy. We need, instead of contractors, we need bureaucrats. And who are they accountable to? Oh, to voters. Yeah, right. He says that Mark used to insist that Facebook was a social utility and neutral platform for people to communicate what they wished. But now it's not. It can't be neutral because it has to make choices. And I agree with that. It has to make choices. But who better to make choices than the people who own the platform? And what are the consequences of now telling people they can't make the choices? We're going to get to the publisher platform question in a minute because I think it's so ridiculous. So he argues, right, that it should be treated, or we should start thinking about it as a publisher, not as a platform. But he goes way a step further. Right? And he says, what Mark Zuckerberg has done to address this, basically, is that Mark has gone to government and asked to be regulated. Mark is, he says, pivoting Facebook's focus towards encouraging more private encrypted messaging that even if Facebook's employees can't see, let alone control. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. If Facebook is, encouraging us to use encrypted messaging, that's cool. That's great. And maybe that's the way when they integrate WhatsApp. WhatsApp is encrypted, right? You could. Mark does not see the messages sent in WhatsApp, at least not today, because they're all encrypted. Maybe that's the integration with Messenger will ultimately bring that kind of encryption to Messenger. That'll be great to the Facebook Messenger. And then he says, second, he is hoping for friendly oversight from regulators and under industry executives. And this is, he's skeptical of this. He says Facebook isn't afraid of a few more rules. It's afraid of an antitrust case and the kind of an accountability that real government oversight would bring. And he's right. I mean, the reason Zuckerberg is for regulation is because he thinks he can control the process. He thinks, and actually, and I don't know that he thinks this way, it gives Facebook a competitive advantage, the regulations do, because they have the resources, the financial resources to deal with them, the competitors do not. But then he goes on, this is great, right? He says, we don't expect calcified rules or voluntary commissions to work to regulate drug companies, healthcare companies, car manufacturers, or credit card providers. Agencies oversee these industries to ensure that the private market works for the public good. You know what I think about the public good. It doesn't exist. The only role of the government is to protect individuals, not to drive for the public good. And indeed, these agencies thwart private good, and therefore, in aggregate, they suppress the public good. We all understand that government isn't an external force meddling in an organic market, he writes. It's what makes a dynamic and fair market possible in the first place. I mean, that again is such a, yes, you need government to have a dynamic market. Not the kind of government he is advocating for. The kind of government he is advocating for destroys market. This should be as true for social networking as it is for air travel or pharmaceuticals. So what we need is another alphabet agency, we are told, both by him and Ezra Klein. What we need is another alphabet agency to regulate social media, just like we regulate air travel and pharmaceuticals. I'd say one of the reasons I had American Airlines is because they don't act like a real company in a competitive market. They act like they're regulated. And indeed, they are regulated, and part of the regulation is restricting competition, for example, by foreign airlines. Foreign airlines cannot compete with American Airlines on flights in the United States. All right. Now, he says, here is 3 solutions, and we'll cover the solutions and my critique of them, and I know, wow, I'm going over an hour now. This can go forever, right? First, Facebook should be separated into multiple companies. You should undo Instagram and WhatsApp acquisitions and ban future acquisitions for several years. So we should spin off Instagram and WhatsApp into separate companies. Of course, how do you prevent Facebook from mimicking the features of Instagram and WhatsApp without buying them like they did to Vine? He doesn't answer that. He can't answer that. Right? He says there's good evidence that this is going to happen because Elizabeth Warren has already called for the FTC to do this. And of course, if Democrats win the presidency, this is what will happen. How would a breakup work? He tells us Facebook would have a brief period to spin off these companies, and the 3 would become instant, distinct companies, and they would be publicly traded. Facebook shareholders would own them for a while, but then they'd have to sell them and so on, right? And then suddenly there would be competition. But would they? Again, what if Facebook? Because this is what, and this is the critique Ezra Klein has, and it's brilliant critique from the left. He says, wait a minute. Facebook got to where it is today, not only because of mergers, but because of competition. Because it outcompeted everybody else. Because it provided the features that people actually wanted. Because it was good at it. Yeah, Ezra Klein says, Ezra Klein's a well-known journalist, commentator on the left. Yeah, he says, I'm not against breaking up a little bit, spinning off these companies. But that's not going to solve the problem. Facebook is going to find other ways to outcompete everybody else. Zuckerberg is good, and he wants to dominate. And he'll keep innovating until he becomes, again, the dominant player. And what happens indeed if Instagram and WhatsApp go out of business because they can't compete with Facebook? What do you do then? And of course, Ezra Klein's answer is, we can't leave this to the market. You can't have competition. This is not something that the marketplace should deal with. It's too important to leave to the marketplace. He says, we need government to control social media, not just regulate it. He says perhaps we want sharp limits on how much time children are permitted to spend on these sites. This is Ezra Klein. Perhaps we want any site with more than 100 million users to have to open its algorithm to public review. Public review, what does that mean? Bureaucrats, regulators to determine the algorithm's okay. Perhaps we want any site with more than 1 billion users to take editorial responsibility for speech on its platform, turn it into a publisher. I'll talk about publishing in a minute. He says, I don't have the answers here. I'm not sure anyone does. But that's why it's so important to start with the right question. Given how important social media platforms have proven to modern life, we should make sure that competition between them serves society's needs, not the market's. Maybe we should nationalize them, that's me. But in other words, government needs to control them, to regulate every aspect of what they do. What we don't need is competition, Chris Hughes. You're too much of a capitalist. So let's say he says, so we break this company up, it's good for everybody, but again, he doesn't see the logical flaw in it. He doesn't see why it doesn't make any sense. And of course, I'm not even talking about the injustice, the immorality of breaking up Facebook, the violation of property rights, the growth in government power and what that means, and now government power over a platform in which we primarily speak. It's the equivalent of government taking over television, of government taking over newspapers. But it's worse than that because we don't just feed the news, we do personal stuff. Now, if Facebook has all this information, what prevents the government from accessing all that information and knowing all that stuff about you? And now the people with a gun have control over that information. Far more dangerous than the marketplace. Oh, but Chris Hughes says, but the biggest winners would be the American people. Imagine a competitive market in which they could choose among one network that offered higher privacy standards, another that at cost of, maybe that'll arise. Maybe. As I said, I know a number of people working on alternatives to the dominant social media platforms today. But breaking it up is not the solution to anything. And it, again, gives the government, because it's not just breaking up, it's breaking up and regulating, enormous power. Enormous power. He goes on to talk about, again, how, antitrust was used to go after AT&T, antitrust was used to go after IBM, all IBM and Standard Oil, and of course the IBM one is particularly stupid, particularly ridiculous. After Microsoft, he thinks that was great. Right? They didn't go far enough, he says. They didn't break up Microsoft, which is what should have happened. And then he says, in terms of privacy, we need to follow the Europeans. We need to set up an agency that is charged with guaranteeing basic privacy on all these platforms. And we need to make sure that we can move our information from one platform to another so that, again, tell the platforms how they structure the data so we can then move it easily from one place to another. more government controls, government intervention, government regulations of private business, of a competitive market, of an industry where people are trying to give us what we want. Now the government is going to destroy all that. Finally, he says, we need an agency that should create guidelines for what's acceptable speech on social media. Now, of all the stuff Chris Hughes says, this to me is the most terrifying. He says, oh, but in America, government doesn't interfere. But then he says, but we already have. We have limits on yelling fire in a crowded theater, child pornography, speech intended to provoke violence, and false statement to manipulate stock prices. Yeah. All of those are not really technically speech. They're all either fraud, making people act in ways that they wouldn't by lying to them, by deceiving them, or use force, child pornography, or provoke violence, which is force. We've never had a government agency that actually defined what it was acceptable to say and what was not acceptable to say in the realm, for example, of political speech. This is a massive turn towards authoritarianism, a massive turn away from freedom, away from liberty, away from the protection of the right to liberty. Of course, he says, whatever the guidelines be, the courts should be able. Well, we know what happens when you set up agencies and the courts start giving more and more and more power to those agencies. They don't curtail, they don't stop, they don't protect our freedoms. They haven't. He says at some point, if we don't have public servants shaping these policies, our speech policies, what is hate speech, what is not? Corporations will. If we don't have public servants shaping these policies, corporations will. Note that here he refers to them as public servants because he's cashing in on the altruism. Oh, public servants are the good guys. They're the ones who care about the public. They're the ones who care about other people. They're the ones who want to make sure that other people are good. Oh, corporations. They're greedy. They're self-interested. They just want to make money. They'll do whatever it takes. Selfishness, bad. Altruism, good. Public servants, good. Businesses, CEOs, corporations, bad. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine? For all of you on the right who want to regulate Facebook, could you imagine what would happen if a government agency set criteria for what we can say on Facebook and what we can't? Who should be in Facebook and who can't be in Facebook? Because there are going to be limits, somewhere. Most of us want looser limits. But I don't think we want pornography on Facebook. Certainly, I think Facebook had a right to exclude pornography. I mean, you could even imagine certain political ideologies Facebook wouldn't want. Out and out, Nazis, out and out communists, if they were treating them equal. I mean, maybe not. But you can imagine they would want some restrictions. But imagine now the government is deciding those things. Government is deciding who's extreme. The government is deciding who's is invoking hate speech. I mean, that would be horrific. Again, government power is the power of a gun. Government power is the government to coerce. There are no choices. You start up a competitor to Facebook because you believe in more speech. You have to abide by the government regulations. You start a competitor which has a completely different business model than Facebook. You still have to abide by the government's regulations. I mean, if this kind of program goes through, this is exactly the path that ends free speech. We still have free speech in this country, even for those who are marginalized. Louis Farrakhan still gives his speeches in his churches all over the place and has a following and people follow him. He just can't do it on Facebook. Now, I think he should be able to do it on Facebook because I think Facebook shouldn't be in a position, should allow for pretty wide array of points of view being put on. The same with Alex Jones. But Alex Jones' ability to speak freely, his free speech rights have now been infringed upon. He still has an audience. He still has an audience. Now, Chris Hughes still wants to somehow be pro-markets at the same time and limit what the government will do, but you heard what Ezra Klein would like to make of it. And one can only imagine what Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump would like to do with an agency that had control over what is acceptable speech and what is not. Right? He ends the article by saying, an era of accountability for Facebook and other monopolies may be beginning. Collective anger is growing, and a new cohort of leaders has begun to emerge. On Capitol Hill, the only leaders he mentions are politicians, right? Well, not only politicians, but on Capitol Hill, Representatives David something has taken a special interest in checking the power of monopolies, and Senators Amy Klobuchar, she's running for president, and Ted Cruz have joined Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren in calling for more oversight, and then economists and other people. He says this movement of public servants, yeah, Elizabeth Warren's my servant. Yes, she is. This movement of public servants, scholars, and activists deserves our support. Mark Zuckerberg cannot fix Facebook, but our government can. Mark Zuckerberg cannot fix Facebook, but our government can. And this is where we're heading, folks. This is where we're heading. And it scares the bejesus out of me. All right. Let me go over this. Let me address one issue, which is the publisher issue. Facebook is not a publisher. Facebook does not have reporters. It does not have articles submitted to it, and it chooses a few and rejects a lot. Facebook is a platform that allows, my guess is 90% of what people submit to be posted. And it has certain standards. Those standards might be wrong. Those standards might be ambiguous. Those standards might be hard to understand. But they have standards where they restrict certain content. It's no different than a auditorium owner who says, anybody can come and give a speech here. But I don't like white supremacists, and I don't like communists, and I don't like objectivists. So I'm not going to rent my hall to objectivists. Anybody going to say, no, you're a publisher because now you're a publisher because you're choosing who to allow in and who not to allow in. No, it's called private property. I've got a platform. I'm going to allow some people to post on that platform and some people not. And some material posted on it I find so offensive I'm going to exclude. It's not a publisher. Publisher has publishing certain standards. It's people submit articles. It reviews the articles. It edits the articles. It only accepts certain, but it doesn't others. It's a platform that has certain standards, just like an auditorium, just like a movie theater. You could have a movie theater. I have a movie theater. I only screen Christian movies. I believe in moral movies, only Christian movies. I don't want non-Christian movies. Does that make me a publisher? No, it just means I have certain standards you might not agree with. And if people don't like my standards, they won't come to my theater. People don't like Facebook standards. At the end of the day, leave Facebook. Greg says on Facebook that the amount accepted in terms of the content produced is way more than 90%. So it's closer to 99.9% probably that's accepted. That's not publishing. Publishing doesn't do that. Right? So the whole idea of treating Facebook as a publisher is bogus. It's a non-starter. It wouldn't, I think even in our court system today, wouldn't stand up in court. And people don't fully press on this because they realize it's an absurdity. I mean, once you start saying that anybody who has a, quote, public platform, but is selective into who can use it or not as a publisher, the term becomes meaningless. And now you're regulating everybody. Okay, I've got 3 other questions I'm going to take. And of course, if you've got another Super Chat question, feel free to ask it here. Can you comment on the claim that Facebook is violating some kind of contract with users? Yes, I mean, I don't think the contract with the users is open-ended in terms of I do think it's more ambiguous than I would like to see it. And also the way it's written, if you read the contract, it's not exactly a contract. It's the general view of how it would be. And if it was a contract, then you would sue Facebook and there would be a way, there would be recourse. But the fact that nobody's actually sued Facebook, and even, we'll see, what's his name, the guy who's suing YouTube, we'll see what happens with that lawsuit. But it's not on contractual grounds. And again, the contracts are written very carefully by Facebook and others, so you won't be able to sue them. So they're written in a way that it's not a binding contract and that it could change the terms. And that the terms are flexible enough to leave them with discretion. Now, you might say that's not good business practice and I don't want to work with a platform like that. Then don't work with that platform. You don't like the contract, don't engage in it. But the contract, to the extent that there's a contract here, well, there is a contract here. It is their side, right? It is on, Facebook is protected here legally. A popular claim is regulation is justified to the extent the company gets subsidized tax breaks if there's any validation of this claim. No, I mean, this is an evil, awful, horrible claim, right? The evil is the subsidy. I don't consider tax breaks evil, although I think they're wrong. I think all companies should be taxed exactly the same in a completely predictable way. I think ideally it's zero, but if you're going to have a corporate tax, it should be flat, simple, no exclusions, particularly no exclusions that benefit some people over others. But no, the fact that a business gets subsidies is an argument to stop the subsidies. Not an argument to give. So the government has power, has too much power, the power to give subsidies. So the solution, let's give them more power. Now they can regulate every company they give a subsidy to. Oh, cool. Then the government should give subsidies to everybody so they can regulate everybody. Basically, they do. No. The solution to problems related to subsidies, tax breaks, is to fight for the right thing, which is to reduce the power of government. Always, whenever you're fighting government, you always should be, every law should be judged based on one criteria. Is it moving us towards more freedom or less freedom? Is regulating a subsidized business moving us towards more freedom or less freedom? Well, less freedom, obviously. Ban it. Ban it. So, the only kind of laws we as believers in free markets support should be laws that move us towards more freedom. Reduce the subsidies, eliminate them. Have a simple, flat tax. Right? Okay. Ideally, what should be banned? Conservative individuals do instead of calling for regulation. Ideally, what should banned conservative individuals do instead of calling for regulation? What is their best possible outcome versus worst possible outcome? Well, I mean, the best thing they can do is figure out an alternative. Invest in an alternative. I mean, there are all kinds of ideas around what an alternative would be. And again, there are people working on it. And Jordan Peterson has said he worries about having his livelihood be dependent now on these platforms, and he wants to create his own platform. But he is facing the same problem that Facebook faces. That is, if he has a platform where everybody can speak, then who's going to be there? The first people to join the platform will be the white supremacists and all the nuts of a variety of different places. And that will keep out everybody else. So he'll never be able to grow the platform to be a Facebook-like competitor, because the first people to engage in it would be the nutcases, and nobody will want to join them. Right? Then the other alternative is to limit, is to ban certain people. But if you ban certain people, then what's the difference between him and every other platform? That's the kind of the catch-22 that they're creating. There might be other approaches. And again, I know several people who are working on technological solutions, technological alternatives to it. Now, the other thing I think banned conservatives, and I don't think many conservatives are being banned, let's be very clear. I think the primary people, I wouldn't insult conservatives that way. Most of the people banned are being wackos. I mean, Milo is not a conservative. He's just in that job. He's a provocateur for the sake of provoking. He's a nihilist of the right. Alex Jones is not exactly a conservative, not in the traditional, benevolent interpretation of what conservatism is. Alex Jones is a conspiracy theory, fake news promoting nutcase, right? So, it's not about conservatives. Well, what should individuals who are banned do? They should advocate for people to put pressure on Facebook to bring them back. Or they should advocate for people to leave Facebook and to boycott Facebook. They should advocate for voluntary action. Either advocate for the creation of an alternative, help create an alternative. A lot of them have a lot of money. They could invest in alternatives. Right? They could advocate for people to boycott Facebook. That's fine. They could advocate for everybody to go on Gab, which is this alternative thing, right? I mean, there are lots of things you can do, as long as they're voluntary. What they are not, what they shouldn't be advocating for, is using force. What they shouldn't be allowed to do is promote the use of violence, which is what they are, which is what regulations would be, right? Which is what regulations would be. All right. I see no super chat questions, so we're probably going to call it a day. Thanks, everybody. I don't know. I mean, there are probably other issues that could be raised around Facebook, so we'll probably be dealing with this issue over and over again. But this article by Chris Hughes was a substantial article. Everybody's relating to it. And I thought it was worth analyzing, particularly in the context of kind of the Ezra Klein article, which is saying, "Oh no, Chris Hughes, you're too fond of capitalism." And of course, it's really. I mean, I find this really, really scary, and we live at a time where the left and the right are united around one thing. Around their distrust of free speech, around their distrust of technology, around their distrust of capitalism. And a free markets, to the extent that they exist, they want those free markets to disappear. They want those free markets to go away. They will do anything to fight those free markets. And that's left and right. Right? So it's very scary. It's very scary. And this is the world Donald Trump has brought us. This is what the left has brought us. This is what Republicans and Democrats and leftists in academia and conservative intellectuals have led us to. A world which distrusts capitalism, which is alienated by markets, alienated by the so-called elites, alienated from intellectuals, and just wants to smash what exists and give more and more power to people like Trump, people like Elizabeth Warren. And I can't think of anything scarier than that. All right, here's one off-topic question, and we'll call it a night. This is off-topic, but Regards to bringing Ayn Rand's ideas to the world and affecting change, what do you think is needed? More monetary support for objectivist groups or more intellectuals? I think more monetary. I think more intellectuals, no question in my mind. Now, how you get more intellectuals is an interesting question, but I think at the end of the day, intellectuals change the world. If you want to change the world, we need 100 Greg Solomiaris. We need 100 objectivist philosophers who are good at communicating the ideas of objectivism. We need 1,000 Yaron Brooks. We need 1,000 people who take those ideas and engage with the public with those ideas, bring them, in a sense, translate them to audiences that are not, take the philosophical ideas and translate them into the applications in politics in every aspect of life, right? We need the equivalents of Jordan Peterson's and Steven Pinker's in objectivism. We need people who are public intellectuals who can take Ayn Rand's philosophical ideas and apply them in psychology. So we need lots of Gina Gorlins. But we need people who can do that, and we need lots of them at the very, foundational philosophical level. Who because I couldn't do. There's no way I could comment on all the news of the day, on everything, apply objectivism the way I do, without the help of people like Greg and Onkar Ghate, who provide me with the kind of the philosophical foundation and tell me that I'm full of it when I'm full of it, when I'm wrong. Hey, I'm wrong sometimes. I'm not a philosopher. I get objectivism wrong sometimes. So, but Onkar will tell me, and if he doesn't tell me, I'm angry with him. And Greg, I know you're listening, or you were listening. Tell me when I'm wrong, because that's the way I learn, and that's the role of a philosopher in a movement, is to help guide the intellectuals like me who are trying to bring these ideas to the public. Yeah, I wasn't trying to make a comprehensive list, right? Tara Smith's and Darrell Wright's, but the point is, we need philosophers. We need then people who can apply their philosophies, Ilan Journos and Steve Simpsons, and again, I don't want to make a comprehensive list because then I'll leave people out of it. But we need all the different layers, but what unites them all is they're intellectuals. They deal with ideas. Ideas change the world. Nothing else does. Not political activism. I mean, you need political activism at the end. Not playing around and not arguing on Facebook, unless it's driven by ideas. Ideas change the world. And the best way to change the world, or the best way to get those ideas out there, or the only way to get the ideas out there, is for intellectuals to apply those ideas to every realm of human interest, to every realm of human engagement. And at the same time, you need scientists, you need artists, you need people applying the ideas in all the different realms that they engage in. It will not happen without scientists doing science and saying things like, the objectivist epistemology really helped me understand the principles that were involved in make possible this discovery that I made in science. That's the speech at the Nobel Prize winning, when they get the Nobel Prize. And you need comedians, and you need artists, and you need all these things, but you need people who apply the ideas in the world, and you need a whole slew of intellectuals who teaches the world about these ideas. That's our job, is to teach. That's what I do. That's what many of the other objectivist intellectuals do out there. And that's what's needed on a ever-growing scale, and we need more and more intellectuals to do that. That, to me, is the primary. And then, objectivist groups is something that's very helpful to you, to applying to your life, and to getting you to be more active, to take the material that you get from the intellectuals and help speak up and help spread it and help get it out there and help articulate it out in the world. All right, but we can talk about the strategy for changing the world another time. Thanks, everybody. I will talk to you maybe tomorrow, Sunday. If I do, it'll be about the same time as today. If not, I'll definitely be back Monday, Tuesday, something like that. So watch out, my Facebook page. See, Facebook. Twitter and Facebook are where I usually let people know about an upcoming show. So if you're not subscribed, subscribe to both of those. Of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you can support the show at yaronbrookshow.com/support. I really appreciate it. It's what makes this possible, and what is going to make it possible for me to continue doing this into the indefinite future. Have a great weekend. Go out and enjoy the sunshine, at least here in Puerto Rico. I'll talk to you all later.